Lady Cordelia Ashworth clutched her threadbare gloves as the morning mist rolled across London's Thames, the merchant ship Prosperity groaning against its moorings like a caged beast eager for freedom. At 26, she had lost everything that once defined her family's fortune squandered by her brother's gambling debts, their name dragged through scandal, their estate seized by creditors. The gangplank stretched before her like a bridge to oblivion, leading to a new world where titles meant nothing, and survival depended on one's own hands. She did not see the elegant black carriage, positioned deliberately among the dock's shadows, nor the grey eyes of Nathaniel Blackwood, 7th Earl of Ravenshollow, watching her every movement with the intensity of a man about to make the most dangerous gamble of his life. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. Lady Cordelia Ashworth stood at the foot of the gangplank, leading aboard the merchant vessel Prosperity, her fingers wrapped so tightly around the worn leather handles of her satchel that her knuckles had turned white beneath her threadbare gloves. The morning mist clung to the Thames like a shroud, carrying with it the mingled scents of coal smoke, rotting fish, and human desperation that marked London's bustling docks at dawn. Her midnight blue travelling dress, once the epitome of fashionable elegance when her father's tailor had crafted it 3 years prior, now bore the telltale signs of hasty packing and sleepless nights spent agonizing over decisions that should never have been necessary for a lady of her former station. The fabric showed wrinkles that spoke of being folded carelessly into a trunk at 2 in the morning, and small tears near the hem that bore witness to her hurried flight through London's less fashionable districts to avoid creditors and curious eyes alike. At 26, Cordelia had never imagined she would find herself clutching her entire worldly possessions in a single bag, preparing to board a merchant vessel bound for the colonies like some common emigrant fleeing debtor's prison. The irony was not lost on her that 6 months ago she had been Lady Cordelia Ashworth, daughter of the late Viscount Ashworth, mistress of Thornfield Manor with its 300 acres of prime countryside, and now she was merely Miss Ashworth, governess-to-be, carrying papers that identified her as an indentured servant to the Pemberton family of Boston. The transformation had been so swift and complete that sometimes she wondered if her previous life had been nothing more than an elaborate dream. The gangplank stretched before her like a bridge between two worlds, and she knew with absolute certainty that once she crossed it, there would be no returning to the woman she had been. The weight of that knowledge settled in her chest like a stone, heavy and cold, but she forced herself to take the first step, then another, because the alternative was starvation in a country that had already forgotten her existence. Behind her, she could hear the calls of the dock workers loading cargo, the creaking of ropes and wood, the general cacophony of commerce that never ceased along the Thames. But she did not turn to look back at the city that had been her entire world until Edmund's gambling and forgery had destroyed everything their father had worked to build. The scandal had broken like a summer storm, sudden and devastating, leaving nothing untouched in its wake. Edmund, her younger brother by 3 years, had always been charming and reckless in equal measure, the sort of young man who attracted admirers and trouble with equal ease. Their father, the late Viscount Ashworth, had died 2 years prior after a brief but brutal illness, leaving the estate and title to Edmund, along with strict instructions about maintaining the family's honor and financial stability. For 18 months, everything had seemed well managed, even prosperous, as Edmund reported strong harvests and successful investments in various trading ventures. Cordelia had been proud of how her brother had seemingly matured into his responsibilities, hosting elegant dinner parties and speaking knowledgeably about agricultural improvements and commercial opportunities. It was only when the bailiffs arrived at Thornfield Manor on a grey February morning, that the truth began to emerge like water seeping through a cracked dam. Edmund had been gambling heavily at the exclusive gentlemen's clubs of St. James's, losing sums that would have been substantial even for a man of their father's considerable wealth. When his own funds ran dry, he had begun borrowing against the estate, using forged documents bearing their late father's signature to secure loans that no responsible lender would have granted to a young man with no proven business acumen. The forgeries were sophisticated enough to fool several prominent banking houses, but eventually someone had grown suspicious and demanded to see the original documents. When Edmund could not produce them, an investigation was launched that uncovered not only the forgeries, but also the staggering extent of his debts. Within a month, Thornfield Manor had been seized by creditors, the family's possessions sold at public auction, and Edmund himself had fled to the continent to avoid arrest. Cordelia had been left to face the social ruin alone, watching helplessly as former friends crossed the street to avoid acknowledging her, as invitations ceased arriving, as even the servants who had worked for their family for decades were forced to seek employment elsewhere because she could no longer afford their wages. From the shadows of an elegant black carriage, positioned with careful deliberation among the merchant vehicles and cargo wagons that crowded the wharf, Nathaniel Blackwood, 7th Earl of Ravenshollow, watched every movement of the woman he had once hoped to make his countess with the focused intensity of a predator studying its prey. At 32, Nathaniel possessed the sort of classical handsomeness that graced Roman statuary, all sharp angles and aristocratic breeding. But his grey eyes held a coldness that spoke of disappointments carefully catalogued and emotions ruthlessly controlled. His reputation in London society was that of a man who approached everything, from business ventures to personal relationships, with the calculating precision of a chess master, never making a move without considering all possible consequences 3 steps ahead. This reputation had been hard-won through years of careful cultivation following his own youthful heartbreak, when Lady Catherine Whitmore had jilted him mere days before their wedding to marry his closest friend for a larger fortune and better connections. Since then, Nathaniel had built his wealth through shrewd investments in shipping, manufacturing, and colonial trade, accumulating power and influence while maintaining an emotional distance that made him both feared and respected in equal measure. His pursuit of Lady Cordelia Ashworth 6 months prior had surprised London society precisely because it seemed to contradict this established pattern of cool calculation. He had courted her with appropriate formality, attending the same social gatherings, partnering her at dinner parties, and eventually requesting permission from her brother to pay his addresses. When he had finally proposed marriage in the conservatory of the Pemberton townhouse during a particularly elegant soirée, he had done so with what he believed to be proper consideration for her circumstances and his own position in society. The proposal itself had been a masterpiece of practical reasoning rather than romantic declaration, as Nathaniel had outlined the advantages their union would bring to both parties. He had spoken of his need for a wife who could manage his various households with grace and intelligence, of her obvious qualifications for such a role, and of the security and position that marriage to him would provide for her and her family. What he had not spoken of were the feelings that had grown within him as he observed her quiet dignity during her father's illness, her gentle handling of social situations that would have defeated less composed women, or the way her rare smiles seemed to illuminate entire rooms with their genuine warmth. He had believed himself to be offering a generous arrangement that would benefit them both, and her rejection had struck him like a physical blow. "Miss Ashworth, I am deeply sensible of the honor you do me," she had said, her voice steady despite the tears he could see gathering in her eyes. "But I cannot accept a proposal born of convenience rather than affection. You deserve a wife who can love you as you deserve to be loved, and I deserve a husband who values me for more than my ability to pour tea and manage servants." Her words had haunted him through the months that followed, particularly as her family's scandal had unfolded, and he had watched from afar as she lost everything that had once defined her place in the world. He had wanted to intervene, to offer assistance or protection, but his pride and her clear rejection of his suit had prevented him from acting. Now, watching her prepare to board a vessel that would carry her across an ocean to a life of servitude among strangers, Nathaniel felt something crystallize within him that was part regret, part determination, and part something he was not yet prepared to name. As the ship's horn sounded its warning that departure was imminent, he made a silent vow that would have surprised anyone who believed they understood the cold, calculating Earl of Ravenshollow. He would bring her back, not through force or manipulation, but by proving himself worthy of the love she had claimed he deserved. The crossing to Boston proved to be an education in hardship that no amount of genteel poverty could have prepared Cordelia for. Yet it was also a revelation of her own strength and adaptability that surprised even herself. Mrs. Margaret Pemberton, the merchant's wife whose children Cordelia had been engaged to teach, proved to be a godsend in the form of a plump, cheerful woman of middle years who possessed both practical wisdom and genuine kindness. Unlike many of her class who might have treated a governess as little more than an upper servant, Mrs. Pemberton seemed to recognize something in Cordelia's bearing and speech that spoke of better days, and she took it upon herself to ease the younger woman's transition from lady to employee with remarkable tact. The ship's cramped quarters meant that privacy was a luxury none could afford, but Mrs. Pemberton managed to create small spaces of dignity within their shared accommodations, ensuring that Cordelia had a corner to call her own, and time each day to attend to her correspondence and personal needs without the constant supervision that might have emphasized her reduced circumstances. The Pemberton children, ranging in age from 6 to 14, presented their own challenges and rewards, as Cordelia discovered that her education, which had once seemed merely ornamental, could be transformed into something genuinely useful. Young Thomas, the eldest, possessed a quick mind and an interest in natural philosophy that reminded her painfully of Edmund before his descent into vice, while the twins, Sarah and Samuel, delighted in her ability to tell stories that made even the most mundane lessons come alive with adventure and romance. The youngest, little Mary, attached herself to Cordelia with the fierce devotion that only a 6-year-old could display, following her new governess everywhere and chattering constantly about everything from the dolphins they spotted playing in the ship's wake to her theories about what sort of houses they would find in America. During the long evenings when the children had been settled for the night and the ship rolled gently beneath a canopy of stars, unlike anything visible from London's smoky sky, Cordelia found herself drawn into conversations with her fellow passengers that would have been impossible within the rigid social structure of English society. There was something about the vastness of the ocean and the shared uncertainty of their destination that broke down barriers and created unexpected intimacies among people who might never have spoken under normal circumstances. She helped a young Scottish woman write letters to her family back home, taught an Irish farmer's son to read using the few books she had managed to bring with her, and listened to the stories of a dozen other emigrants, each carrying their own hopes and sorrows toward an uncertain future in the new world. These interactions gradually awakened within her a sense of purpose that had nothing to do with social position or family obligations, but rather with the simple human need to be useful and valued for oneself alone. Captain Morrison, a weathered man of perhaps 50 years who had been plying the Atlantic routes for most of his adult life, proved particularly helpful in explaining the realities of colonial life and the opportunities that might await someone with her education and background. "The shipping trade between Boston and London is growing stronger every year," he told her one evening, as they stood at the ship's rail, watching the sun set over water that stretched endlessly in every direction. A woman with your accomplishments might find herself in great demand as a teacher or companion, perhaps even establish her own school in time. The company that owns this vessel, Blackstone Shipping, has been expanding their operations considerably, bringing more emigrants and goods across each season. There's money to be made in America for those willing to work for it. And from what I've observed, you're not afraid of honest labor. His words planted seeds of possibility in her mind that began to grow during the remaining weeks of their voyage, transforming her view of their destination from a place of exile to one of potential liberation. Boston in October of 1817 greeted Lady Cordelia Ashworth with a crisp autumn air that carried the mingled scents of wood smoke, salt water, and the peculiar energy that seemed to emanate from a young nation still discovering its own identity. The bustling harbour bore little resemblance to the ancient grandeur of London's Thames, but possessed instead a raw vitality that spoke of endless possibilities and fresh beginnings. After bidding farewell to the Pemberton family, whose kindness during the voyage had sustained her through the worst of her homesickness, Cordelia found herself standing on Long Wharf with her single leather satchel and a letter of introduction to Mr. James Cavendish, one of Boston's most prominent merchants, and a man whose reputation for fairness and integrity had reached even the drawing rooms of London society. The Cavendish residence on Beacon Hill proved to be an elegant Georgian mansion that would not have looked out of place in Mayfair, though it possessed a distinctly American flavor in its furnishings and decoration that spoke of prosperity earned through commerce rather than inherited through generations of noble blood. Mr. Cavendish himself was a man of perhaps 45 years, possessed of the sort of practical intelligence and direct manner that Cordelia was learning to associate with successful American businessmen. His wife Helen, a handsome woman with graying hair and kind eyes, received Cordelia with a warmth that immediately put her at ease, explaining that they had been seeking a governess for their 3 children who could provide not only excellent instruction in traditional subjects, but also the sort of refined accomplishments that would prepare them for society on both sides of the Atlantic. The children themselves proved to be delightfully spirited without being undisciplined, 12-year-old James showing a keen interest in mathematics and natural philosophy, 10-year-old Elizabeth displaying a talent for languages that rivaled her new governess's own abilities, and 8-year-old William possessing an artistic temperament that manifested itself in both drawing and an unusual sensitivity to music. Within days of her arrival, Cordelia found herself settling into a routine that was both more demanding and more satisfying than anything she had experienced in her previous life of privileged idleness. The Cavendish family treated her not as a servant, but as a valued member of their household, including her in dinner conversations when no outside guests were present, and encouraging her to express opinions on topics ranging from literature to politics to the fascinating differences between English and American society that she observed daily in her new surroundings. It was during her second week in the Cavendish employ that Cordelia encountered Arabella Thornton, a fellow English expatriate whose story bore enough similarities to her own to create an immediate bond of understanding between them. Miss Thornton, a woman of 29 with auburn hair and intelligent green eyes, had come to Boston 3 years prior following her own family's financial ruin, though in her case the cause had been her father's failed investment in a cotton plantation that had been destroyed by flooding rather than gambling debts and forgery. Unlike Cordelia, who had secured a position as governess, Arabella had established herself as a teacher of music and French to the daughters of Boston's merchant families, building a reputation for excellence that allowed her to command fees that provided her with genuine independence rather than mere survival. The 2 women met at a lending library on Washington Street, where Cordelia had gone in search of books that might supplement her charge's education, and had instead found herself drawn into conversation with another woman whose accent immediately marked her as a fellow exile from England. "My dear," Arabella had said, after they had introduced themselves and discovered their shared circumstances, "you must allow me to introduce you to the other English ladies who have made their homes here. We are a small but determined band of survivors, and we have learned that in this remarkable country, a woman with intelligence and determination need not depend entirely upon the charity of male relatives or the uncertain prospect of marriage for her security." Their friendship developed quickly, based upon shared experiences of loss and adaptation, but also upon the genuine pleasure each took in the other's company and conversation. Through Arabella, Cordelia was introduced to a circle of women unlike any she had known in England, ladies who had been forced by circumstances to develop skills and independence that would have been considered quite shocking in London society. There was Mrs. Catherine Winters, a widow who had established a small but profitable millinery business, Miss Prudence Hartwell, who supported herself by teaching mathematics to young ladies whose parents believed education should extend beyond mere accomplishments, and Mrs. Elizabeth Dalton, who had scandalized her family by opening a bookshop that had become a gathering place for Boston's intellectual society. These women welcomed Cordelia with an openness that gradually helped her understand that her reduced circumstances need not define her entire future, that in America it was possible for a woman to create her own place in society through her own efforts, rather than through the accident of birth or the good fortune of an advantageous marriage. The freedom to express opinions and engage in serious conversation proved to be one of the most intoxicating aspects of Cordelia's new life, as she discovered that the Cavendish family and their circle not only tolerated but actively encouraged debate on topics that would have been considered entirely inappropriate for ladies in English drawing rooms. During dinner conversations, she found herself discussing the relative merits of democratic versus monarchical government, the moral implications of slavery in the southern states, the potential for westward expansion, and countless other subjects that challenged her to think beyond the narrow confines of her previous existence. Mr. Cavendish, in particular, seemed to delight in drawing out her opinions and then challenging them with gentle but probing questions that forced her to examine her assumptions and develop more nuanced views. "You speak of the stability of monarchy, Miss Ashworth," he might say with a slight smile. "But tell me, what stability did your king provide for your family when circumstances beyond your control destroyed your position in society? Here in America, we believe that a man or woman should be judged by their character and abilities rather than by the accidents of birth or fortune. It is true that our system is imperfect, but at least it offers hope for improvement based upon merit rather than merely upon the favor of hereditary rulers." Such conversations gradually awakened within Cordelia a growing appreciation for American ideals that went far beyond mere gratitude for the opportunity they had provided her, evolving into a genuine intellectual and emotional commitment to principles of equality and self-determination that seemed both revolutionary and profoundly just. Her students, too, contributed to this awakening, as their natural curiosity about the world around them and their unconscious assumption that they could achieve whatever they set their minds to accomplish reminded her daily that she was living in a society that valued potential over precedent, effort over inheritance. After 3 months in her new position, Cordelia finally felt sufficiently settled to write to her childhood friend Imogen Whitmore back in England, though the letter proved more difficult to compose than she had anticipated. How could she explain the transformation that had taken place within her without revealing too much about the pain and humiliation that had driven her across an ocean, or worse, without admitting to feelings about her exile that might be interpreted as criticism of English society and values? "My dearest Imogen," she began. Sitting at the small writing desk in her room one Sunday evening while autumn rain drummed against the windows, "I hope this letter finds you and your family in excellent health and spirits. I must apologize for my long silence, but the adjustment to life in America has required all my attention and energy. I am pleased to report that I have secured an excellent position with the Cavendish family here in Boston, teaching their 3 children who are both intelligent and delightful. The work is more demanding than anything I previously undertook, but I find it surprisingly satisfying to know that my efforts directly contribute to young minds' development, rather than merely serving as ornamental accomplishments. Boston society is quite different from what we knew in London. Less formal, perhaps, but also less constrained by rigid rules about what is proper for ladies to think or say. I have formed friendships with several other English women who have made their homes here, and I am continually amazed by their enterprise and independence. Miss Thornton, who has become my closest friend, has established herself as a music teacher and earns quite enough to maintain her own household without dependence upon anyone. It is a revelation to discover that a woman might support herself through her own talents and efforts, rather than through the generosity of male relatives or the uncertain prospect of marriage. The children I teach ask such penetrating questions about the world around them, and their parents encourage them to think for themselves in ways that would have been considered quite shocking in our old circle there. I find myself developing opinions on subjects I never previously considered, and expressing views that might surprise you with their American flavor. Please do not think I have forgotten my heritage or the friends I left behind, but I confess that this new country offers opportunities for personal growth that I never imagined possible. She deliberately omitted any mention of the thoughts that haunted her quiet moments, the memories of a certain Earl's grey eyes, and the proposal she had rejected in what now seemed like another lifetime. Neither did she speak of the dreams that sometimes visited her in the depths of night, dreams in which she received word that her exile was ended and she might return to England with honor restored, though upon waking she could never quite decide whether such dreams represented hope or nightmare. Meanwhile, in the book-lined study of Ravenshollow House in London, Nathaniel Blackwood sat surrounded by reports from the various agents and investigators he had employed to monitor Lady Cordelia Ashworth's circumstances in America. 6 months had passed since he had watched her board the Prosperity, 6 months during which he had continued to move through London society with his customary cool efficiency, while privately consumed by a growing obsession that would have shocked anyone who believed they understood his character. The reports painted a picture of a woman who had adapted to her reduced circumstances with remarkable grace and determination, securing employment with one of Boston's most respected merchant families, and earning their genuine affection and esteem through her dedication and abilities. She has become quite indispensable to the Cavendish household, wrote his most recent correspondent, a discreet gentleman who had established himself in Boston's commercial circles for the express purpose of observing Miss Ashworth's situation. The family treats her more as a valued friend than as an employee, and she has formed connections within a circle of educated English ladies who have established themselves in various enterprises here. Her reputation for intelligence and refinement has spread beyond her immediate employers, and I am informed that several other prominent families have inquired about engaging her services should she ever leave the Cavendishes. She appears to be in excellent health and spirits, though she maintains a reserve about her past circumstances that has prevented even her closest friend from learning the full details of what brought her to America. Reading these accounts filled Nathaniel with a complex mixture of emotions that he found increasingly difficult to analyze or control: relief at knowing she was safe and well, admiration for the strength and adaptability she had displayed, and underneath it all, a growing determination to prove himself worthy of the woman who had rejected his suit with such devastating accuracy about his motivations. The time had come to act upon the plan that had been forming in his mind since the day of her departure, a plan that would require considerable financial resources and even more considerable patience, but which offered the only hope he could conceive for earning a second chance at winning her regard. Mr. Theodore Blackstone received the Earl of Ravenshollow in his offices near the London docks, with the mixture of deference and wariness that successful merchants typically displayed when dealing with members of the aristocracy, uncertain whether such visits promised profitable business opportunities or troublesome interference in commercial matters beyond noble comprehension. Blackstone was a man of perhaps 60 years, who had built his shipping enterprise from a single vessel inherited from his father into a fleet of 12 ships that plied the Atlantic routes with remarkable efficiency and profit. His reputation for honest dealing and fair treatment of both employees and customers had made Blackstone Shipping one of the most respected names in transatlantic commerce, though he remained personally unpretentious despite his considerable wealth and influence. "Your lordship does me great honor," Blackstone said, as he gestured for Nathaniel to take a seat in his comfortably appointed but not ostentatious office. "How may I be of service to you?" Nathaniel's reply came with the sort of directness that immediately commanded the older man's attention and respect. "Mr. Blackstone, I wish to purchase your entire shipping enterprise." The silence that followed this announcement stretched for several moments before Blackstone recovered his composure sufficiently to respond. "Your lordship, I must confess that your proposal comes as something of a shock. Blackstone Shipping has been in my family for 2 generations, and I had not considered selling. May I inquire what has prompted this interest?" Nathaniel had anticipated this question, and prepared an answer that contained enough truth to be convincing without revealing his true motivations. "I have been looking for opportunities to diversify my investments beyond traditional land holdings and government bonds. The transatlantic trade represents one of the most promising areas for future growth, particularly as America continues to expand and develop. Your company has an excellent reputation and established roots that would provide immediate returns while offering potential for significant expansion. I am prepared to make an offer that would provide you with more than enough capital to pursue whatever other interests you might wish to develop." The negotiations that followed revealed both men to be shrewd and experienced in matters of business, but also possessed of the sort of mutual respect that made complex transactions possible between gentlemen who understood each other's positions and motivations. The final terms of the sale proved generous enough to overcome Blackstone's initial reluctance, particularly when Nathaniel demonstrated both his serious intent and his understanding of the shipping business through detailed questions about routes, schedules, maintenance costs, and personnel management that revealed considerable prior research and preparation. The purchase price included not only the ships themselves, but also the established trade agreements, the experienced captains and crews, the docking rights in both London and Boston, and most importantly for Nathaniel's purposes, the exclusive contracts for passenger service between the 2 cities. Within a month of that initial meeting, Nathaniel found himself the owner of one of England's most successful shipping enterprises, a transformation that required him to learn quickly about aspects of commerce he had previously left to his stewards and agents. His friend Marcus Whitmore, who had known him since their school days at Eton, expressed considerable bewilderment at this sudden interest in trade and transportation. "I must say, old fellow," Marcus observed during one of their regular dinners at White's, "this venture into shipping seems rather out of character for you. Since when have you concerned yourself with the mundane details of commerce? Surely your existing investments provide income enough for even your expensive tastes." Nathaniel's response revealed more than he perhaps intended about the true nature of his motivations. "There are opportunities in America that cannot be pursued from London, Marcus. The colonies, I mean the states, represent a market for both goods and ideas that could prove extraordinarily profitable for men with vision enough to recognize their potential. As for it being out of character, perhaps it is time I demonstrated that an English earl can engage in honest trade without compromising his dignity or his principles. Marcus studied his friend's face with the sort of penetrating attention that long acquaintance made possible. This sudden interest in American commerce wouldn't have anything to do with a certain lady who departed for Boston some months ago, would it? The question hung in the air between them, and for a moment Nathaniel considered deflecting it with the sort of cool dismissal he might once have employed. Instead, he found himself answering with an honesty that surprised them both. Perhaps it would, Marcus. Perhaps a man occasionally discovers that some things are worth pursuing across oceans, even when conventional wisdom suggests he should accept defeat gracefully and look elsewhere for satisfaction. The transformation of Blackstone Shipping under its new aristocratic ownership began with a series of changes that appeared, to outside observers, to represent nothing more than the natural evolution of a successful commercial enterprise under fresh management with considerable capital resources to invest in expansion and improvement. Nathaniel approached his new role as shipping magnate with the same methodical thoroughness that had characterized all his previous business ventures, immersing himself in the minutiae of cargo manifests, sailing schedules, and crew management with a dedication that impressed even the most experienced captains in his employ. Within weeks of completing the purchase, he had implemented a series of improvements that included better provisioning for passenger accommodations, more frequent sailing schedules between London and Boston, and expanded cargo capacity that allowed the company to accept contracts from merchants who had previously been forced to seek alternative shipping arrangements. These changes were presented as logical business decisions designed to maximize profits in an increasingly competitive market, and indeed they did prove remarkably successful in that regard. But they also served the more personal purpose of creating legitimate reasons for the Earl of Ravenshollow to involve himself directly in the Boston trade routes, rather than managing his investment from the comfortable distance of his London offices. Captain Morrison, whose weather-beaten features and straightforward manner had earned Nathaniel's immediate respect during their first meeting in the company's London headquarters, proved particularly valuable as both an advisor on maritime matters and an unknowing source of information about the circumstances of former passengers, including a certain governess whose situation continued to interest the ship's new owner far more than might have been expected from purely philanthropic motives. The captain, who remembered Cordelia's dignified bearing and quiet resilience during the crossing that had brought her to America, spoke of her with genuine admiration when Nathaniel inquired about passengers who had settled successfully in Boston. A remarkable young lady, that Miss Ashworth, Morrison observed during one of their discussions about passenger services and accommodations. She arrived with nothing more than a single bag and a letter of introduction, but from what I hear around the docks, she has made quite a place for herself with one of Boston's finest merchant families. The Cavendish household speaks of her with genuine affection, and word is that several other prominent families have approached her about additional tutoring services for their children. It is gratifying to know that someone who showed such courage in facing difficult circumstances has found her feet so successfully in the new world. Such conversations provided Nathaniel with information he could not have obtained through more direct inquiries without revealing his personal interest in Cordelia's welfare, while also reinforcing his growing conviction that she possessed qualities of character and resilience that made her worthy of any sacrifice he might be required to make in pursuit of a second chance at winning her regard. Meanwhile, in Boston, Cordelia had indeed established herself not merely as a competent governess, but as an educator, whose reputation for excellence had begun to extend well beyond the walls of the Cavendish residence on Beacon Hill. Her success in developing the natural abilities of her charges, while also instilling in them the sort of refined accomplishments that would serve them well in society, had led to requests from other prominent families who wished to engage her services for their own children's instruction. Mrs. Elizabeth Thornfield, wife of a successful shipbuilder, had approached her about providing advanced French conversation for her twin daughters, while Mr. Jonathan Prescott, a banker whose wife had died the previous year, sought someone capable of teaching his motherless son the classics and mathematics that would prepare him for eventual enrollment at Harvard College. These additional engagements, which Cordelia arranged to fulfill during hours when her primary duties to the Cavendish family did not require her presence, provided her with both supplemental income and the satisfying knowledge that her skills were valued sufficiently to command respectable fees. The work was demanding, requiring her to tailor her teaching methods to accommodate students of varying ages and abilities, but it also offered the sort of intellectual stimulation and professional recognition that she had never imagined possible during her previous life of aristocratic idleness. More importantly, perhaps, these expanding professional relationships had introduced her to a broader cross-section of Boston society, allowing her to observe firsthand the possibilities that America offered for individuals willing to work for their advancement rather than depending upon inherited position or family connections. Her friendship with Arabella Thornton continued to flourish, providing not only companionship, but also practical guidance from someone who had successfully navigated the transition from English gentlewoman to independent American professional. Through Arabella's introduction, Cordelia had been invited to join a small literary society that met monthly to discuss current publications and share their own writing efforts, an activity that would have been considered quite inappropriate for a lady of her former station, but which she now found both intellectually rewarding and personally liberating in ways she was still learning to understand and appreciate. It was at one of these literary gatherings that Cordelia first encountered Dr. Sebastian Hartwell, a prominent Boston physician whose practice included many of the city's most distinguished families, and whose reputation for medical skill was matched by his standing as a man of learning and culture. Dr. Hartwell was a widower of perhaps 38 years, possessed of the sort of quiet dignity and intellectual depth that commanded respect in both professional and social circles. And his interest in literature and philosophy had led him to seek membership in the same discussion group that Cordelia had joined through Arabella's sponsorship. Their first meeting occurred during a particularly spirited debate about the merits of Lord Byron's poetry, a discussion that had divided the group between those who admired his artistic genius and those who condemned his notorious personal conduct. When Cordelia offered an observation that managed to acknowledge both positions while suggesting a more nuanced approach to separating artistic achievement from biographical scandal. "Miss Ashworth raises an intriguing point," Dr. Hartwell had responded, his dark eyes showing genuine interest as he studied her face. "If we insist upon moral perfection from our artists, do we not risk depriving ourselves of works that might offer profound insights into the human condition, even if those insights emerge from experiences we cannot personally approve?" Her thoughtful response to this challenge had clearly impressed him, and he made a point of seeking her out for further conversation at the conclusion of that evening's meeting. Their subsequent discussions, which began with literary topics but gradually expanded to include philosophy, medicine, and social reform, revealed a meeting of minds that Dr. Hartwell found increasingly compelling, while Cordelia discovered in him the sort of intellectual companionship she had rarely encountered even in her privileged youth. His courtship, when it began, proceeded with the sort of respectful formality that honored her position while making clear his serious intentions. Gifts of books accompanied by thoughtful notes, invitations to attend lectures and concerts in his company, and gradually more personal conversations about their respective backgrounds and hopes for the future. For the first time since her arrival in America, Cordelia found herself considering the possibility that she might build a new life that included not merely professional success and personal independence, but also the companionship and affection that she had believed forever beyond her reach, given the circumstances of her exile from England and the connections to her past that she could never entirely escape or forget. The prospect of Dr. Hartwell's suit presented Cordelia with emotions and considerations that proved far more complex than she had anticipated when she first began to recognize his interest as something more than casual intellectual friendship. Sebastian, as she had begun to think of him in her more private moments, represented everything that a sensible woman in her circumstances should desire in a potential husband: professional success, social standing, personal integrity, and perhaps most importantly, the sort of genuine affection and respect that promised a marriage based upon compatibility and shared interests rather than mere convenience or financial necessity. His practice provided him with an excellent income that would ensure her security, while his position in Boston society would offer her a place of honor that had nothing to do with inherited titles or family connections, but rested entirely upon his own achievements and character. Their conversations had revealed a man of principle who shared many of her developing views about American democratic ideals and social progress, someone who treated her opinions with the sort of serious consideration that she had learned to value highly during her months of independence. Yet despite these obvious advantages, Cordelia found herself strangely reluctant to encourage his increasingly obvious intentions, troubled by a persistent awareness that her heart remained curiously unengaged, even as her mind catalogued all the rational reasons why she should welcome his courtship. In her most honest moments, she acknowledged that this reluctance stemmed partly from memories of another courtship and another proposal that she had rejected, for reasons that now seemed both prophetic and painfully ironic, given her current circumstances. The Earl of Ravenshollow's offer of marriage had been based upon practical considerations rather than romantic attachment, exactly the sort of arrangement that she now found herself contemplating with Dr. Hartwell, though from the opposite perspective of a woman who possessed little to offer beyond her personal qualities rather than a man seeking a suitable helpmate to grace his established position. The parallel was uncomfortable enough to make her question whether she was being hypocritical in her current hesitations, or whether her rejection of Nathaniel's suit had been based upon principles that should guide her present decision as well. Nathaniel's first journey to Boston as owner of Blackstone Shipping was ostensibly motivated by the sort of business concerns that required personal attention from the company's principal investor, meetings with local merchants to establish new trading relationships, inspection of dock facilities and warehouses, consultation with his captains about optimal cargo loads and sailing schedules, and general oversight of an operation that represented a significant portion of his financial resources. These activities provided entirely legitimate reasons for his presence in the city, while also offering opportunities to gather information about local conditions and personalities that might prove useful in his less acknowledged purpose of learning more about Cordelia's circumstances and the society in which she had established herself. He took rooms at the Tremont House, one of Boston's finest hotels, located conveniently near both the commercial district where his business activities required his presence and the residential areas where the city's prominent families, including the Cavendishes, maintained their homes. His reputation as an English earl engaged in trade rather than merely living off inherited wealth attracted considerable attention from Boston's merchant community, many of whom were curious to meet this aristocratic entrepreneur who seemed to represent a new type of English investor interested in American commercial opportunities. The invitations and social calls that resulted from this curiosity provided him with insights into the complex social dynamics of a city that was simultaneously proud of its independence from European influence and eager to maintain profitable connections with European markets and culture. During these social interactions, he made careful inquiries about educational services and tutoring arrangements, presenting himself as someone who might eventually wish to arrange for English governesses or tutors to be brought over for American families seeking such services, questions that naturally led to discussions of local practitioners in those fields, and inevitably, to mention of a certain English governess whose reputation for excellence had made her much sought after by the city's leading families. The encounter in the lending library on Washington Street was the result of careful planning, rather than fortunate coincidence, though Nathaniel had invested considerable effort in making it appear entirely natural and unexpected. His inquiries about Cordelia's habits and routines, conducted with the sort of discreet thoroughness that his business training had taught him, had revealed that she frequently visited the library on Tuesday afternoons when her duties with the Cavendish children permitted, often in the company of her friend Miss Thornton, or occasionally alone when seeking specific volumes for her educational work. On this particular Tuesday, Nathaniel positioned himself in the library's reading room with a selection of books on American commerce and trade regulations, materials that would explain his presence should anyone observe him, while also allowing him to monitor the entrance and approach Cordelia's customary section when she arrived. When she finally entered, engaged in quiet conversation with the auburn-haired woman he recognized as Miss Thornton from his agent's descriptions, Nathaniel felt his carefully maintained composure nearly desert him as he observed the changes that 8 months in America had wrought in her appearance and bearing. She moved with a confidence and purposefulness that had been absent during their previous encounters in London drawing rooms, her simple but well-made dress suggesting modest prosperity rather than genteel poverty, and her animated discussion of some literary topic with her companion revealed an ease and openness of expression that spoke of a woman who had found her place in the world rather than merely surviving in it. When their eyes finally met across the reading room, the shock of recognition that crossed her features was so pronounced that he could not doubt the genuineness of her surprise, while his own carefully rehearsed expression of pleasant amazement at this unexpected encounter seemed to convince both her and the curious Miss Thornton that fate rather than design had brought them together. "Miss Ashworth," he said, as he approached them with the sort of formal courtesy that their previous acquaintance demanded, "what an extraordinary surprise to encounter you here in Boston. I had no idea that your travels had brought you to this city." Cordelia's response revealed the composure and dignity that had always distinguished her, even in circumstances that must have stirred memories she would prefer to forget. "Lord Ravenshollow," she replied with a slight curtsy that acknowledged both his rank and the public nature of their meeting. "Indeed, this is unexpected. May I present my friend, Miss Arabella Thornton?" Arabella, his lordship, and I were acquainted in London before my departure for America. The introduction was managed with perfect propriety, though Nathaniel detected beneath Cordelia's calm exterior a tension that suggested their encounter was far from welcome, regardless of how skillfully she concealed her true feelings behind the mask of polite social interaction. The conversation that followed, conducted in the formal tones appropriate to chance meeting between former acquaintances now separated by ocean and circumstance, revealed the gulf that had opened between them during the months of separation. A distance that was measured not merely in miles, but in the fundamental changes that their different experiences had wrought in their perspectives and expectations. Nathaniel found himself struggling to reconcile the poised, confident woman before him with his memories of the lady who had rejected his proposal with tears in her eyes, while Cordelia seemed equally disconcerted by this unexpected intrusion of her English past into the American present she had worked so hard to establish. "You mentioned your travels, Lord Ravenshollow," she said, with the sort of polite interest that effectively discouraged more personal inquiries. "Are you visiting Boston on business, or merely satisfying curiosity about our former colonies?" Her choice of words, particularly the phrase "our former colonies" with its subtle emphasis on separation and independence, suggested an identification with American perspectives that Nathaniel found both surprising and somewhat troubling. "Indeed, I have recently acquired interests in the shipping trade between London and Boston," he replied, choosing his words carefully to convey legitimate business purposes without revealing the extent to which those interests were motivated by personal rather than commercial considerations. The opportunities for trade and investment in America seem quite promising for those willing to adapt to new methods and markets. I trust you have found your own circumstances satisfactory since your arrival. The question hung between them, laden with implications that neither could acknowledge directly in their present company, while Miss Thornton observed their exchange with the sort of intelligent interest that suggested she understood she was witnessing something more significant than mere social pleasantries. Before Cordelia could respond, their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Sebastian Hartwell, whose presence immediately altered the dynamics of their gathering in ways that Nathaniel was quick to recognize and analyze, even as he maintained his expression of polite attention. Dr. Hartwell's proprietary manner, as he greeted Cordelia, the obvious pleasure with which she welcomed his arrival, and the natural way in which she included him in their conversation all suggested a relationship that had progressed well beyond casual acquaintance, a realization that struck Nathaniel with unexpected force, despite his logical understanding that a woman of Cordelia's qualities would naturally attract admiration in any society. The introduction of these two men, representing such different aspects of Cordelia's past and present, created a moment of tension that all four participants felt, even as they maintained the facades of civilized discourse, each recognizing that their chance encounter had revealed complications that would require careful navigation in the days to come. The integration of Nathaniel Blackwood, 7th Earl of Ravenshollow, into Boston's merchant society proceeded with remarkable swiftness, facilitated not only by his aristocratic title and obvious wealth, but also by his genuine understanding of commerce and his respectful approach to American business practices that set him apart from the typical English aristocrat who might condescend to engage in trade. Within weeks of his arrival, he had accepted invitations to dine with the city's most prominent families, joined the Merchants' Association that governed much of Boston's commercial activity, and established himself as a serious investor whose opinions carried weight in discussions of trade policy and economic development. His presence at social gatherings became both anticipated and welcomed, as hostesses discovered that an English earl who could discuss shipping routes and tariff regulations with the same facility that he brought to conversations about literature and European politics represented exactly the sort of distinguished guest who elevated the tone of their entertainments while also contributing meaningfully to the serious business discussions that inevitably arose among Boston's commercially minded elite. The irony was not lost on Nathaniel that he had traveled across an ocean to pursue a woman who had rejected his suit, only to find himself genuinely engaged by the entrepreneurial energy and democratic ideals of American society in ways that surprised him with their authenticity and depth. His business interests, which had begun as elaborate justification for his presence in Boston, evolved into legitimate enthusiasm for the opportunities that American commerce presented. While his interactions with merchants who had built their fortunes through intelligence and industry rather than inheritance challenged many of his previous assumptions about the relationship between birth and worth. These expanding social connections inevitably brought him into frequent contact with the same circles in which Cordelia moved, a circumstance that he had anticipated and cultivated, but which proved more emotionally complex than his careful planning had prepared him to handle. At musical evenings where she might be present with Dr. Hartwell, at dinner parties hosted by families whose children she taught, at cultural lectures and literary discussions where their paths crossed with what appeared to be natural coincidence, but was actually the result of his meticulous attention to her schedule and preferences, Nathaniel found himself observing the woman he had crossed an ocean to pursue, living a life that seemed both familiar and utterly transformed from the existence she had known in England. The sight of Cordelia in these social settings, moving with confidence through conversations that would have been impossible for her in London's more rigid society, expressing opinions on topics ranging from American literature to democratic governance, with an intellectual freedom that illuminated her features and animated her gestures in ways he had never previously witnessed, filled Nathaniel with emotions that ranged from admiration to frustration to a growing awareness that the woman he was pursuing had evolved far beyond the lady he had proposed to in that London conservatory. Her friendship with the independent-minded women of Boston's intellectual society had clearly influenced her perspective on questions of personal autonomy and social equality, while her professional success as an educator had given her a confidence in her own abilities that transformed her bearing and manner in subtle but profound ways. When she spoke during dinner conversations about the merits of American educational methods or the opportunities that democratic society provided for individual advancement, her voice carried a conviction and enthusiasm that made clear these were not merely polite topics of conversation, but subjects about which she had developed genuine expertise and passionate beliefs. Dr. Hartwell's obvious pride in her accomplishments and his respectful attention to her opinions created a dynamic between them that Nathaniel found increasingly difficult to witness, not because he questioned the physician's worthiness as a suitor, but because their relationship seemed to represent exactly the sort of partnership based on mutual regard and shared interests that he had failed to offer during his own courtship. The irony was particularly sharp, given that Cordelia's growth and development during her months in America had made her even more worthy of genuine devotion rather than the calculating arrangement he had initially proposed. Yet his very presence in Boston pursuing her might be seen as evidence that he remained incapable of the sort of selfless love that she had every right to expect from a husband. These observations, and the painful self-awareness they generated, made their social encounters exercises in carefully controlled emotion, as Nathaniel struggled to maintain appropriate courtesy while privately wrestling with jealousy, regret, and a growing understanding of how thoroughly he had misunderstood both Cordelia's character and his own feelings when he had first approached her family about marriage. Cordelia's position within this complex social dynamic became increasingly untenable as she found herself required to navigate between Dr. Hartwell's sincere and growing attachment, her own confused response to Nathaniel's unexpected presence in her carefully constructed new life, and the watchful curiosity of Boston society, which had begun to take notice of the apparent competition between two such distinguished suitors for the attention of an English governess whose background remained somewhat mysterious despite her obvious refinement and accomplishments. Her friendship with Arabella Thornton provided both comfort and challenge during this difficult period, as Arabella's direct manner and practical wisdom forced Cordelia to examine her own motivations and responses with uncomfortable honesty. "My dear Cordelia," Arabella observed during one of their private conversations as they walked through Boston Common on a crisp November afternoon, "I cannot help but notice that you seem less than entirely pleased by Dr. Hartwell's obvious devotion, despite his many admirable qualities and the security that marriage to him would provide. Nor can I ignore the fact that you become distinctly uncomfortable whenever Lord Ravenshollow joins our social gatherings, though he conducts himself with perfect propriety and seems genuinely interested in American society and business. As your friend, I feel obligated to ask whether there is some history between you and his lordship that might explain your apparent distress at his presence in Boston." The question, posed with Arabella's characteristic blend of delicacy and persistence, forced Cordelia to confront the extent to which her past relationship with Nathaniel continued to influence her present circumstances and feelings. She found herself describing the proposal scene in the Pemberton Conservatory, the scandal that had destroyed her family's position, and her reasons for rejecting an offer that had seemed based more on practical convenience than genuine affection, while Arabella listened with the sort of thoughtful attention that encouraged complete honesty about motivations and fears that Cordelia had previously examined only in the privacy of her own thoughts. "But my dear," Arabella said when the account was complete, "are you certain that pride did not play as large a role as principle in your decision to refuse his lordship's suit? A proposal based on practical considerations need not indicate absence of deeper feelings, particularly when offered by a man whose position in society would require him to consider such matters carefully, regardless of his personal inclinations. Moreover, his presence here in Boston, which cannot be entirely explained by business interests, however legitimate they may appear, suggests that his feelings may have been more engaged than his formal manner of proposing would have indicated. The observation struck Cordelia with uncomfortable force, compelling her to acknowledge that her rejection of Nathaniel's suit had indeed been influenced by wounded pride as much as principled objection to marriage based on convenience rather than love. The business enterprises that Nathaniel had established in Boston continued to flourish beyond his most optimistic projections, providing him with both financial success and genuine satisfaction in ways that justified his extended residence in the city, on grounds that had nothing to do with his personal pursuit of Cordelia Ashworth. His shipping operations had expanded to include not only passenger service and general cargo, but also specialized transport for the growing textile industry, lumber trade, and agricultural exports that represented New England's most profitable economic activities. The warehouse facilities he had purchased and expanded near Boston Harbor employed dozens of local workers at wages that were notably generous compared to industry standards, a practice that had earned him respect among both employees and competing merchants who recognized fair treatment of workers as a mark of character as well as good business sense. His involvement in local commercial associations had led to appointment to several committees concerned with harbor improvements and trade regulation, positions that required regular attendance at meetings and consultations that effectively established his presence in Boston as both necessary and permanent rather than temporary. The success of these endeavors had encouraged him to consider additional investments in American enterprises, including a proposal to establish a school for the children of working families who could not afford the fees charged by existing educational institutions, a project that would require careful planning and significant financial commitment, but which appealed to his growing appreciation for democratic ideals and social progress. These activities provided him with legitimate reasons to remain in Boston indefinitely, while also giving him opportunities to demonstrate the sort of principled commitment to community welfare that might eventually convince Cordelia that his character possessed depths beyond the calculating businessman who had proposed to her in London. The irony was not lost on him that his pursuit of one woman had led him to discover aspects of his own nature and values that he had not previously recognized or acknowledged, transforming what had begun as an elaborate courtship strategy into genuine engagement with questions of social responsibility and personal purpose that extended far beyond his original romantic objectives. The complexity of Cordelia's situation reached its crisis point on a December evening when Dr. Hartwell, after months of patient and respectful courtship, finally requested a private interview in which he formally offered her his hand in marriage, along with his heart and the security of his established position in Boston society. The proposal took place in the Cavendish drawing room after a dinner party that had included readings from contemporary American poets and spirited discussion of the cultural independence that the young nation was developing alongside its political and economic autonomy. Dr. Hartwell had listened throughout the evening to Cordelia's thoughtful contributions to these conversations with obvious pleasure and admiration, and when the other guests had departed, he had asked permission to speak with her privately about a matter of mutual concern. "Miss Ashworth," he began with the sort of formal dignity that honored the importance of the moment while also reflecting his respect for her intelligence and character, "I believe our friendship over these past months has demonstrated a compatibility of mind and spirit that forms the foundation for deeper attachment. Your accomplishments as an educator, your grace in society, and your many personal qualities have convinced me that my happiness and usefulness in life would be greatly enhanced by your companionship as my wife. I am aware that your circumstances have required you to value independence and self-reliance in ways that many women of your background have not been required to develop, and I wish to assure you that marriage to me would not diminish, but rather enhance those qualities that I most admire in your character. My practice provides me with sufficient income to ensure your security and comfort, while my position in Boston society would offer you opportunities to pursue your educational interests and community involvement according to your own inclinations and judgment. Most importantly, I offer you not merely the protection of marriage, but genuine affection and respect that I believe could develop into the deepest love, given time and mutual commitment to our shared happiness. His words, delivered with evident sincerity and thoughtful consideration for her particular circumstances and needs, represented exactly the sort of proposal that any rational woman in her position should welcome with gratitude and joy, yet Cordelia found herself requesting time to consider his generous offer, rather than accepting immediately as both prudence and inclination should have prompted. The turmoil that Sebastian's proposal created within Cordelia's heart and mind forced her to confront the uncomfortable truth that her feelings remained entangled with memories and possibilities that she had believed herself to have resolved through the practical necessities of building a new life in America. Her sleepless nights following his declaration were filled with painful self-examination as she attempted to separate rational gratitude for his worthy affection from the emotional confusion that Nathaniel's presence in Boston had created, acknowledging that she could not, in good conscience, accept marriage to one man while her thoughts remained occupied with another, regardless of how impractical or ill-advised those persistent feelings might be. The prospect of security, companionship, and respected position that Sebastian offered represented everything she should desire for her future, particularly given the uncertain nature of her current circumstances and the limitations that her past would always impose on her options in life. Yet the memory of conversations with Nathaniel in London drawing rooms, the intensity she had sometimes glimpsed behind his controlled exterior, and the uncomfortable possibility that she had misjudged both his feelings and his character during their previous acquaintance, created doubts that prevented her from embracing the happiness that lay within her grasp through acceptance of Sebastian's suit. The knowledge that Nathaniel had traveled across an ocean and established legitimate business interests that kept him in Boston might indicate either the sort of persistent devotion that deserved consideration or merely the stubborn pride of a man unaccustomed to rejection, and her inability to determine which interpretation was correct left her paralyzed between competing possibilities and loyalties that seemed impossible to reconcile through reason alone. Meanwhile, Nathaniel's observation of these developments from his necessarily distant position created frustrations that tested his self-control and moral principles in ways that his previous experiences had not prepared him to handle. His respect for Cordelia's autonomy and his recognition of Dr. Hartwell's obvious worthiness as a suitor prevented him from attempting direct interference in their relationship, yet his awareness of the physician's growing attachment and probable intentions filled him with urgency that made careful patience increasingly difficult to maintain. The knowledge that a proposal was likely imminent, combined with his understanding that any reasonable woman in Cordelia's circumstances should accept such an advantageous offer, forced him to confront the possibility that his pursuit had been both futile and selfish, motivated more by wounded pride than genuine love, and therefore deserving of failure, regardless of his sincere appreciation for the woman she had become during their separation. The temptation to reveal his own feelings and intentions grew stronger with each social gathering, where he observed her obvious comfort with Sebastian's attention. Yet his awareness of how such a declaration might appear, given his previous proposal and her subsequent exile from England, made him hesitate to risk destroying whatever chance remained for earning her regard through patient demonstration of his changed character and deeper understanding of her worth. The constraint imposed by these competing considerations created a tension that manifested itself in his increased dedication to his business activities and community involvement, as if proving himself worthy of American democratic ideals might somehow qualify him for consideration as a husband worthy of a woman who had embraced those ideals with such evident sincerity and success. The revelation that would ultimately alter Cordelia's understanding of Nathaniel's character came through an unexpected conversation with Mrs. Helen Cavendish, whose connections to London business circles had provided her with information about the Earl of Ravenshollow's commercial activities and philanthropic interests that cast his recent behavior in an entirely different light. "My dear Cordelia," Mrs. Cavendish observed one morning as they reviewed the children's educational progress in her private sitting room, "I have received a most interesting letter from my cousin Margaret in London, who writes of remarkable changes in the shipping trade since Lord Ravenshollow acquired the Blackstone Company. It seems his lordship has not only improved wages and working conditions for sailors and dock workers, but has also established a school for the children of working families that provides education at no cost to parents who could never afford such opportunities for their offspring. Margaret writes that the school has become a model for similar institutions, and that his lordship's involvement in its daily operations suggests genuine commitment to social progress rather than merely charitable display for public approval." The information struck Cordelia with the force of revelation, compelling her to reconsider her assumptions about Nathaniel's motivations and character in light of evidence that suggested depths of principle and compassion that had not been apparent during their previous acquaintance in London's more artificial social environment. The confrontation between Cordelia and Nathaniel finally occurred on a blustery January afternoon when circumstances conspired to leave them alone together in the Cavendish library, where she had been reviewing lesson plans for the following week's instruction while he had called to discuss shipping arrangements for educational materials that Mr. Cavendish was importing from England for his expanding business interests. The awkward small talk that had characterized their previous encounters in Boston society could not survive the intimacy of the empty room and the weight of unresolved questions that had accumulated during the months since his arrival in the city. The pretense of casual acquaintance finally crumbled when Cordelia set aside her papers and turned to face him with the sort of direct gaze that had first attracted his attention in London drawing rooms, though her expression now carried a steel that spoke of hard-won independence rather than aristocratic composure. "Lord Ravenshollow," she said, her voice steady despite the rapid beating of her heart, "I believe it is time we addressed the remarkable coincidence of your presence in Boston and your sudden interest in the shipping trade between America and England. Surely a man of your intelligence does not expect me to believe that business considerations alone have kept you in this city for so many months, particularly when your previous investments were confined to land holdings and government bonds that required little personal oversight." Nathaniel felt the careful facade he had maintained crumble under the weight of her penetrating scrutiny, recognizing that the woman before him possessed both the courage and perception to demand honesty, regardless of how uncomfortable such revelations might prove for both of them. He had anticipated this moment, yet found himself unprepared for the mixture of relief and terror that accompanied the prospect of finally acknowledging truths that he had concealed behind layers of legitimate business activity and social propriety. "You are correct, Miss Ashworth," he replied after a moment's hesitation that revealed more than his carefully chosen words. "My acquisition of the Blackstone Shipping Company was motivated by considerations beyond mere commercial opportunity, though I must emphasize that the business has proved remarkably profitable, and my continued involvement serves legitimate purposes that extend well beyond any personal interest I might have in your circumstances." She continued to study his face with an intensity that made him acutely aware of how much he had changed during their months of separation, how his pursuit of her had forced him to examine his own character and motivations in ways that had revealed uncomfortable truths about the man he had been versus the man he hoped to become. The admission hung between them like a bridge that neither seemed entirely willing to cross. Though both recognized that retreat was no longer possible given the directness of her challenge and his partial acknowledgement of ulterior motives. The silence that followed stretched uncomfortably as each waited for the other to speak, until finally Nathaniel found the courage to voice at least a portion of the truth that had brought him across an ocean. Miss Ashworth, Cordelia, I must confess that my original proposal to you was inexcusably inadequate, motivated more by recognition of your obvious suitability as a wife than by proper appreciation of your many qualities as an individual worthy of genuine devotion. I offered you an arrangement that would have benefited my position while providing you with security, but I failed to speak of feelings that I was perhaps too proud or too ignorant to acknowledge even to myself at the time. When you rejected my suit, your words forced me to examine not only my approach, but my entire understanding of what marriage should represent, and what you deserved from any man fortunate enough to earn your regard. His confession revealed a vulnerability that surprised them both, stripping away the controlled facade that had always characterized his public persona and revealing glimpses of the emotional depth that Cordelia had sometimes suspected might exist beneath his aristocratic composure. The months since your departure have taught me that my feelings for you were far deeper than I understood when I made that clumsy proposal. And I have come to Boston not merely to pursue you, but to discover whether the man I have become through examining my own failures might possibly prove worthy of the woman you have become through overcoming circumstances that would have defeated someone of lesser character. I do not ask for immediate forgiveness of my past shortcomings, only for the opportunity to demonstrate through actions rather than words that my regard for you encompasses far more than the practical considerations that governed my original approach. Cordelia listened to his halting confession with emotions that ranged from anger to sympathy, to a growing understanding that her own pride and fear had perhaps colored her interpretation of both his original proposal and his subsequent behavior in ways that were not entirely fair or accurate, and the courage required for him to acknowledge his mistakes and expose his deeper feelings commanded her respect, even as his presence in Boston continued to represent a complication she was not prepared to handle, given her unresolved response to Dr. Hartwell's proposal and her carefully constructed independence. Lord Ravenshollow, Nathaniel, she said, using his given name for the first time since their reunion in the library. I must acknowledge that my rejection of your original proposal was influenced as much by wounded pride as by principled objection to marriage based on practical considerations rather than affection. Your manner of proposing, while perhaps lacking in romantic declaration, was not inherently insulting, and a woman in my circumstances should perhaps have been more grateful for an honorable offer from a man of your character and position. However, I cannot ignore the fact that you have crossed an ocean to pursue someone who clearly indicated her lack of interest in your suit, a persistence that suggests either inability to accept rejection gracefully or a belief that women's decisions can be overturned through sufficient pressure and patience. The accusation struck him with unexpected force, compelling him to recognize how his actions might appear from her perspective, regardless of his internal motivations or the sincerity of his feelings. Neither interpretation speaks well of your respect for my autonomy and judgment, she continued, her voice carrying a firmness that reminded him of the strength that had enabled her to survive exile and build a new life in a foreign country. If you have indeed developed deeper feelings for me than you possessed at the time of your original proposal, why did you not express them directly rather than establishing an elaborate charade of business interests that forces me to question the honesty of every interaction we have shared since your arrival in Boston? The challenge in her question forced Nathaniel to confront the uncomfortable reality that his careful approach had been motivated as much by fear of rejection as by respect for her circumstances, a recognition that undermined his claims of having learned to value her autonomy and independence. "You are absolutely correct to question my methods," he admitted with a self-deprecating honesty that surprised them both. "I have hidden behind business pretenses because I feared direct confession of my feelings would be seen as the persistence of a man who cannot accept rejection, or worse, as an attempt to take advantage of your changed circumstances to pressure you into reconsidering a proposal you had every right to refuse. The irony is that in trying to protect both of us from the potential embarrassment of renewed rejection, I have created exactly the sort of deceptive situation that justifies your distrust of my motives and methods. Perhaps the truth is that despite all my claims of personal growth and deeper understanding, I remain too much of a coward to risk my heart by stating plainly that I love you and would consider myself the most fortunate of men if you could find it in yourself to give me another chance to prove my worth as a potential husband." The words hung between them with stark honesty that left both feeling exposed and uncertain, as if they had finally reached the heart of conflicts that had shaped their relationship from its beginning. Neither seemed prepared to respond immediately to such a direct declaration, each recognizing that whatever they said next would determine whether their future interactions would be characterized by honest communication or continued misunderstanding and emotional distance. The weight of unspoken possibilities and the knowledge that Dr. Hartwell awaited her response to his own honorable proposal created a tension that made the library feel suddenly airless, despite the winter wind rattling the windows and the comfortable warmth of the fire that burned in the nearby hearth. Before either could find words to bridge the chasm that honest confession had opened between them, their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Cavendish, whose cheerful greeting and obvious pleasure at finding Lord Ravenshollow visiting their home effectively ended any possibility of continuing their emotionally charged discussion. The remainder of his visit passed in the sort of polite social conversation that provided refuge from deeper topics, while both struggled to process what had been revealed and what remained unspoken between them. Nathaniel departed with formal courtesy that concealed his inner turmoil, while Cordelia found herself unable to concentrate on her lesson planning as she replayed every word of their exchange and tried to determine what she actually felt beneath the confusion of conflicted loyalties and unresolved emotions. The honesty of his confession had touched her in ways she was reluctant to acknowledge, yet his admission that fear had motivated his indirect approach only confirmed her suspicion that he remained incapable of the sort of straightforward communication that any successful relationship would require. More troubling still was her own emotional response to his declaration of love, a response that suggested her feelings for him remained more engaged than she had been willing to admit to herself, despite her rational appreciation for Dr. Hartwell's many admirable qualities and the security that marriage to him would provide. The complexity of her situation had deepened rather than clarified, leaving her more uncertain than ever about how to proceed with either potential suitor or how to reconcile her heart's inclinations with her mind's calculations about what would be best for her future happiness and security. The knowledge that she could not indefinitely postpone her response to Dr. Hartwell's proposal while she sorted through her confused feelings about Nathaniel added urgency to considerations that seemed to grow more rather than less complicated with each passing day. The letter from Imogen Whitmore arrived on a grey February morning that seemed to match perfectly the somber news it contained, though its contents would ultimately prove more illuminating than tragic, despite the personal losses it described. Cordelia had been expecting correspondence from her childhood friend for several weeks, as her own recent letter describing her circumstances in Boston had included specific questions about mutual acquaintances and the state of English society that required thoughtful response. What she had not anticipated was news that would fundamentally alter her understanding of both her family's situation and Nathaniel's character in ways that cast their recent confrontation in an entirely different light. "My dearest Cordelia," the letter began in Imogen's familiar handwriting, "I write with news that I know will cause you pain, though it may also provide a form of closure regarding the circumstances that brought you to America. Your brother Edmund met his end last month in a duel with Lord Pemberton's son over gambling debts and accusations of cheating that could not be resolved through any other means. The details are sordid and need not be repeated, but I thought you should know that his suffering, and yours by extension, has finally ended, though not in the manner that either of you would have wished. However, there is additional news regarding your family's affairs that may provide some comfort in your grief, though it reveals actions taken on your behalf that were deliberately concealed from public knowledge. It has recently become known, through circumstances too complex to explain in a letter, that Lord Ravenshollow quietly settled all remaining debts against the Ashworth estate some months ago, using his personal funds to satisfy creditors who had been unable to collect from Edmund's estate. Moreover, his lordship arranged for the estate itself to be held in trust rather than sold, apparently in hopes that someday it might be restored to family ownership should circumstances permit. These actions were undertaken without fanfare or expectation of public acknowledgement, and indeed most of London society remains unaware of his involvement in preserving what remains of your family's legacy. I would not have learned of it myself, except that my husband's business connections revealed Lord Ravenshollow's extraordinarily generous handling of what were legally his own concerns, as the debts had been incurred through forgery, and therefore carried no moral obligation for repayment beyond what honor and compassion might dictate. The revelation struck Cordelia with the force of a physical blow, compelling her to set aside the letter temporarily, while she absorbed implications that reached far beyond the simple facts of Edmund's death and their estate's preservation. The knowledge that Nathaniel had secretly acted to protect her family's remaining assets while she had been struggling to build a new life in Boston suggested depths of character and commitment that contradicted everything she had believed about his motivations and feelings during their original acquaintance in London. His generosity had been extended without expectation of gratitude or acknowledgement, at a time when she had already rejected his proposal and departed for America, indicating that his concern for her welfare transcended any purely selfish interest in winning her regard or overcoming the sting of rejection. The carefully planned business enterprises that had brought him to Boston might indeed serve legitimate commercial purposes, but the pattern of his behavior both before and after her departure suggested a consistency of devotion that she had been too proud or too fearful to recognize during their recent confrontations. The letter continued with details that only deepened her growing understanding of how thoroughly she had misjudged the man who had crossed an ocean in pursuit of her regard. Imogen described his establishment of the school for working-class children, his fair treatment of employees in his various business enterprises, and his quiet support for several charitable organizations that served London's poorest residents, activities that painted a picture of principled commitment to social progress rather than the calculating pursuit of advantage that had characterized her previous assessment of his motives. Perhaps most significantly, Imogen reported conversations with mutual acquaintances who had observed Nathaniel's behavior during the months following Cordelia's departure, describing a man who had seemed genuinely affected by her absence rather than merely frustrated by an unsuccessful business negotiation. "Lord Ravenshollow appeared quite altered following your departure for America," Imogen wrote, "less inclined to social gatherings and more absorbed in business affairs that seemed to consume his attention in ways that suggested personal rather than purely financial interest. Several ladies of our acquaintance made efforts to engage his attention for themselves or their daughters, but he showed no interest in forming new attachments, leading to considerable speculation about his continued bachelor status and his apparent indifference to eligible young women who would have welcomed his addresses. The growing weight of evidence that Nathaniel's feelings for her were both genuine and deep created an internal conflict that made concentration on daily responsibilities almost impossible. As Cordelia found herself reviewing every interaction they had shared since his arrival in Boston, with new understanding of what his carefully controlled behavior might have concealed. His admission during their recent confrontation that he had hidden behind business pretenses from fear of rejection took on entirely different meaning when considered alongside evidence of his generous actions on behalf of her family's honor and financial security. The man who had quietly preserved her inheritance while allowing her to believe herself entirely cut off from her previous life possessed depths of thoughtfulness and commitment that contradicted her assumptions about his character and motivations in fundamental ways. Yet this new understanding only complicated her situation rather than clarifying it, as she remained pledged to provide Dr. Hartwell with a response to his honorable proposal, while her heart and mind reeled with the implications of discoveries that cast her entire understanding of the past year in a different light. The knowledge that Nathaniel had acted with such generosity and discretion made her previous criticisms of his pursuit seem both ungrateful and unjust, while his confession of love during their library encounter acquired new credibility when viewed alongside evidence of consistent devotion that extended far beyond mere wounded pride or stubborn persistence. The complexity of choosing between two worthy men had been difficult enough when she believed Nathaniel's interest to be primarily selfish, and Sebastian's to be entirely altruistic. But the revelation that both suitors possessed depths of character and genuine feeling for her created moral and emotional dilemmas that seemed almost impossible to resolve through rational consideration alone. Dr. Hartwell's growing impatience with her continued delays in responding to his proposal became increasingly apparent during their subsequent encounters, as his normally patient demeanor showed signs of strain that testified to the depth of his feelings and his natural desire for certainty about their future relationship. Sebastian, as she had begun to think of him during their months of growing intimacy, possessed too much intelligence and sensitivity not to recognize that her distraction stemmed from concerns that extended beyond mere maidenly hesitation about accepting his generous offer. "My dear Cordelia," he said during a quiet moment at a musical evening they attended together, "I hope I have not been presumptuous in expecting a response to my proposal by now, but I confess that your continued uncertainty creates anxiety that affects both my professional concentration and my personal peace of mind. If you have concerns about any aspect of our potential union, I would prefer that you express them directly, rather than allowing them to create distance between us that serves neither of our interests." His directness commanded her respect, even as it increased the pressure she felt to reach a decision that would affect not only her own future, but the happiness of two men who deserved better than to be kept in suspense while she struggled with revelations that had fundamentally altered her understanding of past events and present possibilities. "I must be honest with you, Sebastian," she replied, using his given name to soften the impact of words that she knew would disappoint him. "There are aspects of my past that have recently come to light and that require me to reconsider assumptions I had made about relationships and obligations that I believed to be permanently settled. I realize this explanation must seem inadequate given the patience and consideration you have shown me, but I cannot in good conscience accept your generous proposal while my understanding of my own heart and circumstances remains so unsettled." The pain that crossed his features at her words reminded her forcibly that her confused feelings carried consequences that extended far beyond her own emotional comfort, and that whatever decision she ultimately reached would require her to accept responsibility for the happiness or disappointment of men whose regard she valued, even if she could not return their feelings with equal intensity. Nathaniel's business proposition arrived at the Cavendish household on a crisp March morning, delivered in person with the sort of formal ceremony that indicated its importance, while his carefully composed expression suggested the personal stakes that extended far beyond mere commercial considerations. Mr. Cavendish received him in his private study, where shipping ledgers and trading documents covered every available surface in testimony to the growing complexity of his business empire and his increasing involvement in the lucrative Atlantic trade routes that connected New England's emerging industries with European markets. The proposal that Nathaniel presented represented the culmination of months of careful planning and strategic thinking, designed to offer genuine commercial advantage while creating circumstances that would require Cordelia's direct participation in ways that could not be dismissed as romantic manipulation disguised as business opportunity. Mr. Cavendish, he began with the directness that had characterized his most successful negotiations, I wish to propose an exclusive trading arrangement between my shipping operations and your importing business that could prove extraordinarily profitable for both parties, though it would require the services of someone with intimate knowledge of both English and American commercial practices, cultural preferences, and social expectations. The terms he outlined were indeed generous beyond anything the Cavendish family might have anticipated, offering them privileged access to English manufacturers and European luxury goods at prices that would allow substantial profit margins while guaranteeing shipping space and priority scheduling that would give them significant competitive advantages over other Boston importers. However, the complexity of managing such an arrangement, with its requirements for cultural sensitivity, diplomatic communication, and detailed understanding of both markets' particular demands, would necessitate employing someone with unique qualifications that seemed to point inevitably toward Cordelia's involvement, despite Nathaniel's careful avoidance of mentioning her name during his initial presentation. The position he described would involve correspondence with English suppliers, negotiation of contracts that required understanding of both legal systems, coordination of shipping schedules with social and commercial calendars on both sides of the Atlantic, and general oversight of cultural considerations that could make the difference between spectacular success and embarrassing failure in ventures that bridged two increasingly different societies. Mr. Cavendish listened to the proposal with the sort of focused attention that substantial profit opportunities commanded from successful merchants, though his astute business sense detected implications that extended beyond purely commercial considerations despite the legitimate advantages that Nathaniel's offer represented. The financial benefits were undeniable, promising to transform his already successful enterprise into one of Boston's most prominent and profitable trading houses, while providing security for his family that would extend through several generations if properly managed. Yet his paternal affection for Cordelia and his understanding of her complicated relationship with Lord Ravenshollow created concerns about placing her in a position that might compromise either her professional reputation or her personal peace of mind, particularly given Dr. Hartwell's obvious courtship and the delicate emotional situation that had developed during the months since Nathaniel's arrival in Boston. "Your lordship's proposal is indeed generous," Mr. Cavendish replied after careful consideration, "and the commercial advantages you describe would certainly benefit my family's interests in ways that extend far beyond our current capabilities. However, I must express concern about placing Miss Ashworth in a position that might subject her to criticism from those who question the propriety of a young lady engaging in such extensive business correspondence and negotiation, particularly when that business involves such close cooperation with a gentleman whose personal interest in her welfare has been the subject of considerable speculation among our social circles." The objection was diplomatically stated, but pointed enough to require direct response from Nathaniel, who had anticipated such concerns and prepared arguments that emphasized professional considerations while acknowledging the social complexities that his proposal created. "I understand your reservations, Mr. Cavendish, and I share your concern for Miss Ashworth's reputation and comfort, which is why I have structured the arrangement to provide her with genuine authority and compensation that would establish her position as a valued business associate rather than merely an employee subject to inappropriate influence or pressure. The salary I propose would provide her with financial independence that few women of any background enjoy, while the nature of the work would demonstrate her capabilities in ways that could lead to even greater opportunities should she choose to pursue them in the future." The discussion of terms and conditions that followed revealed both men's understanding that they were negotiating not merely a business arrangement, but also the framework within which Cordelia's future relationship with Nathaniel would develop, whether toward renewed personal attachment or toward the sort of professional association that might eventually allow both to move beyond their complicated past. The position would require her to maintain an office within the shipping company's Boston headquarters, where she would work closely with Nathaniel during his increasingly frequent visits to oversee operations and expansion opportunities. Circumstances that would make avoiding personal conversation and emotional complications virtually impossible, despite their apparent focus on commercial matters. The compensation package that Nathaniel proposed was indeed generous enough to provide genuine independence, offering not only a substantial salary, but also a percentage of profits from transactions she facilitated, an arrangement that could eventually make her wealthy enough to pursue whatever future she chose without dependence upon marriage or employment for financial security. When Mr. Cavendish presented the proposition to Cordelia that evening, describing both its advantages and its potential complications with the sort of fatherly concern that her own father might have shown in similar circumstances, she found herself confronting a choice that would determine not only her professional future, but also her ability to resolve the emotional conflicts that had tormented her since learning of Nathaniel's secret assistance to her family, and his genuine motivations for pursuing her across an ocean. The opportunity represented everything she had discovered she valued during her months in America: professional recognition, financial independence, the chance to use her intelligence and education in ways that contributed meaningfully to important enterprises, and freedom from the constraints that traditional female roles imposed upon women of intelligence and ambition. Yet accepting the position would mean working intimately with the man whose presence in her life continued to create emotional turmoil that interfered with her ability to make rational decisions about her future, including her response to Dr. Hartwell's patient but increasingly urgent courtship. The emotional complexity of her situation reached its climax when Dr. Hartwell, whose patience with her continued delays had finally reached its limits, requested a private interview in which he presented her with what amounted to an ultimatum disguised as a final appeal to her reason and affection. They met in the Cavendish garden on a mild April afternoon, where spring blossoms provided a backdrop that seemed to mock the serious nature of their conversation and the pain that she knew her words would inevitably cause to a man who deserved only happiness and fulfillment in his personal life. "Cordelia," Sebastian began, using her given name with the sort of intimate familiarity that their months of courtship had established, "I can no longer pretend that your continued uncertainty about my proposal represents merely the natural caution of a woman considering the serious step of marriage. Your distraction and emotional distance during our recent encounters suggest that your heart is engaged elsewhere, despite whatever practical advantages our union might offer you." The dignity with which he confronted what must have been a painful realization only increased her respect for his character, while deepening her regret that she could not return his feelings with the intensity they deserved. "I have tried to be patient because I believed that time and gentle persistence might overcome whatever reservations prevented you from accepting what I hoped you recognized as a sincere offer of love and partnership. But I now see that my continued courtship may be preventing you from pursuing happiness that lies in a different direction. His generosity in acknowledging her right to follow her heart, even when it led away from him, demonstrated exactly the sort of selfless devotion that should have made accepting his proposal an easy and joyful decision. Yet Cordelia found herself unable to offer him anything more than honest admission that her feelings were indeed engaged elsewhere, despite her uncertainty about whether those feelings could ever be reciprocated or lead to lasting happiness. "Sebastian," she replied, using his name with the sort of tenderness that acknowledged both her affection for him and her regret at disappointing his hopes. "You deserve far better than a wife whose heart remains partially committed to another, regardless of how uncertain that other attachment might prove to be. Your offer of marriage has honored me beyond anything I believed possible when I first arrived in Boston as an exon from my previous life. And your patient courtship has demonstrated exactly the sort of character and devotion that any woman should value above all other consideration. If I were capable of choosing my feelings based upon rational assessment of merit and compatibility, I would accept your proposal with gratitude and joy, confident that our marriage would bring happiness to both of us and security to any children we might be blessed with. However, I have learned during these months of self-examination that the heart follows its own logic, often in directions that contradict what wisdom and prudence might recommend. I cannot, in good conscience, bind myself to you through marriage vows while knowing that part of me remains attached to someone else, no matter how impractical or potentially futile that attachment might prove to be." Her words, delivered with evident pain but unwavering honesty, effectively ended his courtship while preserving the mutual respect that had always characterized their relationship. Though the sadness in his eyes as he accepted her decision reminded her forcibly of the costs that following one's heart could impose upon innocent people whose only fault lay in loving unwisely or too well. His final words as he took his leave demonstrated the nobility that made her rejection of his suit particularly difficult to bear. "I hope that whoever has claimed your affections proves worthy of the gift he has received, and that you find the happiness you deserve, even if it cannot be found with me." The grace with which he accepted defeat only reinforced her awareness that she was choosing uncertainty over security, emotional complications over peaceful domesticity, and the possibility of heartbreak over the certainty of respected affection. The decision to accept Nathaniel's business proposition while declining Sebastian's marriage proposal represented Cordelia's conscious choice to prioritize professional independence and personal autonomy over traditional female security and social expectations, a decision that reflected how profoundly her months in America had altered her understanding of women's capabilities and rights. The announcement of her new position within the expanded Blackstone shipping operations created considerable discussion within Boston's merchant community, where reactions ranged from admiration for her business acumen to concern about the propriety of such extensive professional involvement for a young lady of her background and education. Those who supported her appointment pointed to her obvious qualifications, including her intimate knowledge of English society and commercial practices, her demonstrated abilities as an educator and communicator, and her successful adaptation to American business methods during her employment with the Cavendish family. Critics questioned whether any woman could manage the complex negotiations and cultural sensitivities that international trade required, while others expressed more personal concerns about the wisdom of placing herself in such close professional proximity to a man whose romantic interest in her had been the subject of considerable speculation. These discussions reflected broader debates about women's roles in American society, where democratic ideals of equality and individual merit often conflicted with traditional assumptions about feminine capabilities and appropriate spheres of activity, making Cordelia's appointment a symbol of changing social expectations that extended far beyond her personal circumstances or relationship with Lord Ravenshollow. Her first weeks in the position proved both challenging and exhilarating, as she discovered that her education and social experience had indeed provided her with skills that translated effectively into commercial success, while her natural intelligence and attention to detail enabled her to master the practical aspects of international trade with surprising speed and confidence. The daily proximity that her new position created between Cordelia and Nathaniel gradually broke down the formal barriers that had characterized their interactions since his arrival in Boston, replacing careful social courtesy with the sort of professional collaboration that required honest communication about practical matters, while creating opportunities for personal conversation that felt natural rather than contrived. Their work together revealed aspects of both their characters that had been obscured by the emotional complications and social pressures that had shaped their previous relationship, allowing each to appreciate qualities in the other that justified the growing attraction they were still reluctant to acknowledge directly. Nathaniel's approach to business proved to be characterized by exactly the sort of principled consideration for employees and trading partners that his charitable activities had suggested, while his willingness to defer to Cordelia's judgment on matters where her expertise exceeded his own demonstrated the respect for her intelligence and capabilities that his original marriage proposal had failed to express adequately. Similarly, Cordelia's professional competence and creative problem-solving abilities impressed not only Nathaniel, but also the ship captains, warehouse supervisors, and merchant contacts who worked with her regularly, establishing her reputation as someone whose opinions carried weight based upon merit rather than social position or personal connections. The success of their partnership in generating profits and expanding business opportunities provided both practical justification for their working relationship and evidence that their personal compatibility extended beyond romantic attraction to include genuine intellectual and professional partnership that could sustain long-term collaboration regardless of how their emotional relationship might develop. Yet beneath the surface of their professional success, both struggled with growing personal feelings that made their daily interactions increasingly charged with unspoken possibilities and carefully controlled desires, creating a tension that required constant vigilance to prevent personal matters from interfering with business responsibilities, while making their continued avoidance of emotional honesty increasingly difficult to maintain as weeks turned into months of intimate collaboration and mutual respect. The hurricane that struck Boston Harbor in late September arrived with the sort of devastating fury that reminded even the most experienced mariners of their helplessness against nature's most violent moods, transforming the normally bustling waterfront into a scene of chaos where massive waves crashed over the docks and winds of terrifying intensity threatened to destroy everything in their path. The storm had been building for days, with experienced captains reading the ominous signs in the increasingly turbulent skies and the unnatural stillness that preceded the tempest's arrival. But even those who had weathered countless Atlantic gales were unprepared for the sheer magnitude of destruction that the hurricane unleashed upon the harbor and the ships that sheltered there. Nathaniel received word of the approaching danger while reviewing shipping manifests in his office, where Cordelia had been working alongside him on arrangements for a particularly complex series of cargo transfers that required coordination between multiple vessels and careful timing to ensure that valuable goods reached their destinations without damage or delay. The urgent message from Captain Morrison described conditions at the harbor that demanded immediate attention from anyone with authority to make decisions about ship movements and cargo protection, as several Blackstone vessels remained at anchor in positions that would expose them to the full force of the storm unless emergency measures could be implemented before the worst weather arrived. Without hesitation, Nathaniel began preparations to travel to the docks personally, despite Cordelia's growing alarm, as reports filtered in describing wind speeds and wave heights that made any activity near the waterfront extremely dangerous for anyone not absolutely essential to rescue operations. The rational part of her mind understood that his presence might indeed be necessary to coordinate the complex logistics of moving ships to safer anchorage or securing valuable cargo that represented substantial financial investments. But her emotional response to the prospect of him exposing himself to such obvious peril revealed feelings that she had been struggling to suppress during their months of working together in apparent professional harmony. "Nathaniel," she said, her voice betraying more concern than professional courtesy would normally permit. "Surely Captain Morrison and the other experienced seamen can manage the necessary operations without requiring you to risk your safety in such conditions." "Your authority can be exercised through written instructions that would provide the captains with whatever legal protection they might need for taking emergency measures without exposing you to dangers that serve no practical purpose beyond satisfying some misguided notion that ownership requires personal presence during every crisis." Her protests, motivated by genuine fear for his welfare rather than concern about business operations, only strengthened Nathaniel's determination to personally oversee the rescue efforts. Partly from legitimate worry about the substantial financial losses that inadequate coordination might cause, but primarily from a deeper need to demonstrate the sort of courage and leadership that he believed essential to earning the respect of men whose livelihood depended upon his decisions. Moreover, his months of working closely with Cordelia had awakened within him a desire to prove himself worthy of the sort of admiration that her obvious competence and fearless approach to challenges commanded from everyone who worked with her, making the prospect of remaining safely distant while others faced danger on his behalf seem like cowardice that would diminish him in her eyes, regardless of whatever rational justifications might be offered for such caution. "Cordelia," he replied, using her given name with the sort of intimate familiarity that their daily collaboration had gradually established, despite their careful maintenance of professional boundaries. "I appreciate your concern for my safety, but I cannot, in good conscience, ask men to risk their lives protecting my property while I remain comfortably removed from the dangers they face. These ships represent not merely financial investments, but the livelihood of dozens of families whose welfare depends upon the success of our operations, and my presence during this emergency may make the difference between saving those vessels and losing them, along with the cargo they contain." His words carried conviction that she recognized as fundamental to his character, the sort of principled commitment to responsibility that had motivated his secret assistance to her family and his establishment of schools and charitable institutions that served people whose circumstances provided them with no claim upon his generosity beyond common humanity. Yet her growing understanding of his essential integrity only intensified her fear at the prospect of losing him to the sort of heroic gesture that might cost him his life while serving no purpose that could not be accomplished through less dangerous means, making her realize with painful clarity that her feelings for him had evolved far beyond professional respect or grateful acknowledgement of his assistance during her family's difficulties. As reports from the harbor grew increasingly alarming throughout the afternoon, describing conditions that deteriorated with each passing hour as the storm's full fury began to manifest itself in waves that crashed completely over the longest piers and winds that made simple communication nearly impossible between men working only yards apart, Cordelia found herself unable to concentrate on any task other than monitoring the messages that arrived with irregular frequency from the dock areas where Nathaniel was directing increasingly desperate efforts to save what could be saved and minimize losses that seemed to grow more inevitable with each update. Her anxiety reached levels that interfered with her ability to maintain even the pretense of normal activity, as she paced restlessly around their shared office space while attempting to distract herself with correspondence and contract reviews that required attention, but which seemed utterly insignificant compared to her worry about Nathaniel's safety amid conditions that were claiming lives among even the most experienced sailors and dock workers. The irony was not lost on her that she was discovering the true depth of her feelings for him at precisely the moment when those feelings might be rendered permanently irrelevant by the storm that threatened to sweep him away before she could find the courage to acknowledge what her heart had perhaps known for longer than her mind had been willing to admit. When the news finally arrived that he had been injured during rescue operations, struck by debris while helping to secure a ship's rigging that had broken loose in the wind and was threatening to destroy the vessel's masts and sails, Cordelia abandoned all pretense of professional detachment and rushed to the makeshift medical station that had been established in a warehouse near the docks to treat the various injuries that the storm was inflicting upon those brave enough or foolish enough to venture into its path. She found him unconscious on a rough cot, his head bandaged and his clothing torn and soaked with a mixture of seawater and blood, while Dr. Hartwell worked over him with the sort of focused intensity that demonstrated both his professional skill and his personal concern for a patient whose recovery might determine the happiness of the woman he still loved, despite her rejection of his marriage proposal. Sebastian's report on Nathaniel's condition revealed injuries that were serious but not life-threatening, though the blow to his head had left him unconscious and feverish in ways that made his immediate recovery uncertain and required careful monitoring to ensure that more serious complications did not develop during the critical hours that would determine whether he had suffered permanent damage. The doctor's professional demeanor could not entirely conceal his awareness of the emotional significance that Nathaniel's welfare held for Cordelia, whose obvious distress at seeing him injured provided final confirmation of feelings that Sebastian had suspected but hoped might prove less deeply rooted than his own attachment to her. "Miss Ashworth," he said quietly as he completed his initial examination and began preparations for the ongoing care that Nathaniel's condition would require. "His injuries are significant, but not beyond recovery. Though he will need constant attendance during the next several days while his body heals and the effects of the head trauma resolve themselves. If you wish to remain with him, I can arrange for nursing assistance, though I must warn you that his fevered state may cause him to say things that should not be taken as reliable indicators of his normal thoughts or feelings." The offer, made with characteristic generosity despite the personal pain it must have caused him, provided Cordelia with the opportunity she needed to remain close to Nathaniel during his recovery, while maintaining the sort of propriety that their unmarried status required, even under such extraordinary circumstances. Her acceptance of the nursing role marked a turning point in their relationship, as the intimacy required by his care broke down the last barriers that professional courtesy and social convention had maintained between them during their months of careful collaboration, while his fevered confessions revealed truths that conscious restraint had prevented him from acknowledging during their previous interactions. The hours that followed proved to be a revelation for both of them, as Nathaniel's delirium stripped away the careful control that normally governed his speech and behavior, allowing him to express feelings and motivations that he had concealed behind layers of business justification and social propriety throughout their complicated courtship. As Cordelia tended to his needs, cooling his fever with damp cloths and ensuring that he took the medications that Dr. Hartwell had prescribed for his recovery, she listened to rambling monologues that provided insights into his character and feelings that conscious conversation had never revealed. "Cordelia," he murmured during one of his more lucid moments, his voice hoarse but clear enough to be understood, "I never meant for you to think that I valued you only for your social connections or family name. Even before your father's death, before Edmund's troubles, I was drawn to your intelligence and independence in ways that had nothing to do with practical considerations or social advantage." When I bought the shipping company, it was not merely to pursue you, but because I could not bear the thought that you might be in need while I possessed the means to ensure your security and comfort. The confession revealed depths of feeling and consideration that his formal marriage proposal had failed to convey, while also explaining actions that she had interpreted as manipulative pursuit when they had actually been motivated by genuine love and concern for her welfare. His fevered words continued throughout the night, describing his regret over the inadequacy of his original proposal, his admiration for the strength she had shown in building a new life in America, and his growing recognition that the woman he loved was far more remarkable than the suitable wife he had originally sought to acquire through marriage negotiations that had treated her as a prize to be won rather than a partner to be cherished. During the quiet hours before dawn, when Nathaniel's fever had broken and his breathing had settled into the regular patterns that indicated genuine rest rather than unconscious delirium, Cordelia finally allowed herself to examine honestly the feelings that his injury had forced her to confront, and his confessions had illuminated in ways that made continued denial impossible. The terror she had experienced at the prospect of losing him had revealed that her heart had been engaged far longer and more deeply than her pride had been willing to acknowledge, while his fevered revelations about his motivations had answered questions that had tormented her since learning of his secret assistance to her family and his persistent presence in Boston, despite her apparent indifference to his suits. The man she had rejected for offering marriage based on practical considerations rather than genuine affection had been motivated by feelings deeper than either of them had understood at the time, while her own rejection had been influenced as much by fear of being valued for her social connections rather than her personal qualities as by principled objection to marriages of convenience. The recognition that they had both allowed pride and misunderstanding to prevent honest communication about feelings that might have led to happiness months earlier filled her with regret that was tempered by hope that their current circumstances might provide opportunities for the sort of truthful conversation that their previous encounters had lacked. When Nathaniel finally awakened fully conscious and aware of his surroundings, his first coherent words confirmed that his fevered confessions had been accurate expressions of feelings he had been too constrained by propriety and fear of rejection to express during their working relationship. "Cordelia," he said softly, his grey eyes focusing on her face with an intensity that made her heart race, despite her attempt to maintain nursing propriety. "I hope that my ramblings during the night have not caused you embarrassment or distress. I fear that fever may have loosened my tongue in ways that conscious discretion would normally prevent." Her response, delivered with the sort of direct honesty that their months of professional collaboration had taught her to value above social convention, marked the beginning of the frank conversation that would finally resolve the misunderstandings that had kept them apart despite their mutual attraction and growing love. "Nathaniel," she replied, taking his hand in hers with a gesture that acknowledged the shift from professional care to personal intimacy. "Your words during the night revealed feelings that I have hoped to hear expressed, but never dared encourage because of my own uncertainty about whether they could be genuine, given the circumstances of our original acquaintance and subsequent relationship. I must confess that my rejection of your first proposal was motivated not only by objection to marriage based on practical considerations, but also by fear that you could never value me for my own qualities rather than for my family connections and social position there. The months since then, particularly our work together, and my growing understanding of your character through observing your treatment of employees and business associates, have convinced me that my assessment of your motivations was both incomplete and unfair. Moreover, the terror I experienced yesterday when I learned of your injury forced me to acknowledge feelings that I have been struggling to deny even to myself, feelings that have grown stronger rather than weaker despite my attempts to maintain purely professional boundaries between us." Her admission created the opening for honest discussion that both had needed but neither had possessed the courage to initiate, leading to conversations that continued throughout his convalescence and gradually revealed the depth of mutual misunderstanding that had complicated their relationship from its beginning, while also confirming the genuine love that had motivated their seemingly contradictory behavior during the month since his arrival in Boston. The formal business partnership agreement that Cordelia and Nathaniel negotiated during his recovery represented far more than a simple redistribution of commercial responsibilities and profits, establishing instead a revolutionary model of professional equality that challenged conventional assumptions about women's capabilities, while also creating the legal framework necessary to protect Cordelia's interests in an enterprise that had grown beyond anything either of them had originally envisioned. The documents that their lawyers prepared granted her full partnership status in the American operations of Blackstone Shipping, with decision-making authority that extended to all aspects of trade negotiations, personnel management, and strategic planning, while also providing her with ownership shares that would ensure her financial security, regardless of what the future might bring to their personal relationship. Nathaniel's insistence that the partnership terms be structured to protect her independence rather than creating dependence upon his goodwill demonstrated the depth of change that their months of working together had wrought in his understanding of what genuine partnership required, while Cordelia's careful attention to the legal details revealed her own growth from a woman who had once been entirely dependent upon male relatives for her security to one who understood the importance of protecting her own interests through careful planning and professional expertise. The negotiations themselves proved to be exercises in mutual respect and consideration, as each worked to ensure that their agreement would serve both their commercial interests and their personal values, creating a model of business partnership that honored both her need for autonomy and his desire to share with her the success that their collaboration had generated. When the final documents were signed in the presence of witnesses who understood they were observing something unprecedented in Boston's commercial circles, both partners felt a satisfaction that extended beyond mere business achievement to encompass a sense that they were creating something genuinely new and potentially transformative in their approach to professional relationships between men and women. The partnership announcement, when it appeared in Boston's commercial newspapers, generated reactions that ranged from admiration for Cordelia's obvious qualifications to skepticism about whether any woman could successfully manage the complex responsibilities that international trade required, while also creating speculation about the personal relationship between partners whose romantic attachment had been the subject of considerable social discussion during the month since Nathaniel's arrival in the city. The societal challenges that their unconventional arrangement created proved to be both more and less difficult than either had anticipated, as their obvious professional success gradually overcame initial skepticism about their business capabilities, while persistent gossip about their personal relationship continued to provide entertainment for those who found their refusal to conform to traditional expectations, either fascinating or scandalous, depending upon individual perspective and prejudices. The progressive merchants of Boston, many of whom had built their own fortunes through innovation and willingness to challenge established practices, generally supported their partnership as evidence of American democratic ideals in practical application, pointing to their impressive profit margins and expanding trade relationships as proof that merit rather than gender should determine business opportunities. However, more conservative elements of both Boston and English society expressed concern about the implications of their arrangement for traditional family structures and social hierarchies, questioning whether women's involvement in commercial enterprises might undermine the domestic harmony and moral influence that feminine virtue was supposed to provide through separate spheres of activity. These criticisms were particularly sharp from English correspondents, who viewed Cordelia's business partnership as evidence of dangerous American ideas about equality that threatened to contaminate proper English ladies with notions about independence and self-determination that contradicted established social order. The couple's response to such criticism was to maintain their focus on professional excellence while conducting themselves with dignity that demonstrated their commitment to high moral standards, regardless of whether their approach to business partnership conformed to conventional expectations about appropriate behavior for ladies and gentlemen. Their success in expanding trade relationships, improving working conditions for employees, and generating profits that benefited not only themselves, but also the broader Boston commercial community, gradually silenced most practical objections, while providing ammunition for supporters who argued that their model pointed toward future possibilities for American society that would benefit from women's intelligence and capabilities rather than limiting them to purely domestic roles. The letters from England that arrived during the autumn following their partnership announcement brought news that transformed Cordelia's understanding of her relationship with her family and homeland, while also providing evidence of how completely Nathaniel's actions had succeeded in restoring the honor and security that Edmund's gambling and forgery had destroyed. Her mother, Lady Catherine Ashworth, wrote with a mixture of gratitude, pride, and maternal concern that revealed how thoroughly the family's circumstances had been transformed through Nathaniel's generous intervention and careful management of their remaining assets. "My dearest daughter," the letter began, "I hope this correspondence finds you in excellent health and prospering in your new circumstances, which I understand from various sources have evolved far beyond what either of us might have anticipated when you departed England under such difficult conditions. I write primarily to express my profound gratitude to Lord Ravenshollow for his extraordinary generosity in preserving our family estate and restoring our financial security at a time when we had no claim upon his assistance beyond common humanity and whatever regard he had formed for your welfare. His actions have been conducted with such discretion that London society remains largely unaware of his involvement in resolving the difficulties that Edmund's behavior created for our family. But his kindness has enabled me to maintain our home and position while also providing resources for charitable activities that honor your father's memory. Moreover, I have learned through reliable sources that Lord Ravenshollow's business enterprises and philanthropic activities have earned him respect that extends far beyond his inherited position, suggesting that his character has depths that perhaps were not apparent during his original courtship, but which subsequent events have revealed in ways that reflect great credit upon his integrity and moral principles. The letter continued with expressions of maternal blessing for whatever relationship might develop between Cordelia and Nathaniel, acknowledging that their partnership in business and potential union in marriage represented choices that lay outside traditional expectations, but which seemed to promise happiness and fulfillment that conventional arrangements might not provide given their particular circumstances and characters. The wedding plans that gradually took shape during their discussions of the future reflected both their desire to honor the communities that had supported them during difficult periods and their commitment to creating a celebration that symbolized their intention to build lives that bridged different worlds rather than choosing one society over another. They decided upon a ceremony in Boston that would include the friends and colleagues who had witnessed their professional partnership and personal growth, followed by a celebration in England that would mark Cordelia's return to her homeland as Nathaniel's partner, rather than as the egged governess who had fled scandal and poverty 2 years earlier. The Boston ceremony was planned for Trinity Church, where both had attended services during their months of courtship and business collaboration, with reception festivities at the Tremont House that would accommodate the merchant families, professional associates, and personal friends who had become important parts of their American lives. Dr. Sebastian Hartwell agreed to serve as one of the witnesses despite the personal pain that their happiness must have caused him, demonstrating the sort of noble character that made Cordelia's rejection of his suit particularly difficult, while also providing evidence of the respect that Nathaniel had earned from men who might have been expected to view him as an unwelcome rival for local affections. Arabella Thornton took charge of arrangements for the ladies' celebration that would precede the wedding ceremony, organizing gatherings that honored both English and American traditions, while also acknowledging the unique nature of a union that represented partnership rather than the traditional transfer of a woman from her father's protection to her husband's authority. The English celebration would take place at Thornfield Manor, which Nathaniel's careful preservation had restored to its former elegance, providing an opportunity for Cordelia to reclaim her family heritage while demonstrating to English society that her American experiences had enhanced rather than diminished her qualifications as a lady worthy of respect and admiration. The logistics of coordinating celebrations separated by an ocean required the sort of detailed planning and international communication that their business partnership had taught them to manage effectively. While the symbolic importance of marking their union in both countries reflected their intention to maintain connections to communities and values that had shaped their individual development. The wedding ceremony itself, conducted on a brilliant October morning when New England's autumn foliage provided a spectacular backdrop for the celebration of new beginnings, represented the culmination of a courtship that had tested both partners' character while demonstrating their capacity for growth and mutual adaptation that promised well for their future happiness together. Trinity Church was filled with guests whose presence testified to the respect and affection that Cordelia and Nathaniel had earned within Boston's commercial and social circles, creating an atmosphere of genuine celebration that extended far beyond the conventional politeness that often characterized society weddings. Mr. and Mrs. Cavendish sat in places of honor that acknowledged their role in providing Cordelia with the opportunities that had enabled her professional success and personal growth, while Captain Morrison and other Blackstone employees occupied pews that demonstrated the couple's commitment to treating their business associates as valued friends rather than mere subordinates. Arabella Thornton served as Cordelia's attendant, her obvious joy in her friend's happiness providing evidence of the genuine affection that had sustained their friendship through difficulties and uncertainties that might have strained relationships based on less solid foundations. The ceremony itself was conducted with appropriate dignity, while also incorporating elements that reflected the couple's commitment to partnership rather than traditional hierarchy, including vows that emphasized mutual support and shared responsibility for their future together, rather than conventional promises of feminine obedience and masculine protection. When Nathaniel placed the ring upon Cordelia's finger, his words of commitment acknowledged not only his love for her, but also his respect for her intelligence and independence, promising to honor her judgment and support her ambitions while building together the sort of life that would fulfill both their individual potential and their shared dreams. The reception that followed provided opportunities for celebration that reflected both the joy of the moment and the broader significance of a union that represented new possibilities for relationships between men and women who chose partnership over convention. The toasts offered by various guests revealed the impact that Cordelia and Nathaniel's courtship and business collaboration had made upon observers who recognized that their success challenged traditional assumptions about women's capabilities, while also demonstrating that love based upon mutual respect could create stronger foundations for marriage than arrangements motivated primarily by social or financial considerations. Mr. Cavendish spoke eloquently about Cordelia's contributions to his family's prosperity and happiness, emphasizing that her professional achievements had enhanced rather than diminished her feminine qualities, while Dr. Hartwell offered gracious wishes for their future that demonstrated the nobility of character that made him worthy of respect despite his disappointment in love. The celebration continued late into the evening, with dancing and conversation that brought together people whose lives had been touched by the couple's journey from misunderstanding to partnership, creating memories that would sustain them through whatever challenges their future might bring. while also providing inspiration for others who might seek to create relationships based upon equality rather than traditional gender roles and expectations. As the evening drew to a close and guests began to depart with expressions of affection and best wishes for the future, Cordelia and Nathaniel found themselves alone together as husband and wife for the first time, facing a future that promised both adventure and security based upon the solid foundation of mutual love, respect, and shared commitment to building something meaningful together. 5 years later, as Cordelia stood at the same Boston dock where she had first arrived as a desperate governess, carrying her worldly possessions in a single leather satchel, she marveled at the transformation that love and partnership had wrought, not only in her own circumstances, but in the broader possibilities that her marriage had helped to create for other women seeking independence and professional recognition in American society. The Blackstone shipping empire had expanded under their joint leadership to include not only passenger and cargo services between Boston and London, but also educational exchange programs that brought American students to English universities and English teachers to American schools, creating cultural connections that enriched both societies while also demonstrating the practical benefits of international cooperation based upon mutual respect rather than colonial dominance. The schools they had established in working-class districts of both Boston and London had become models for educational innovation that combined practical skills with classical learning, providing opportunities for children whose parents could never have afforded traditional private instruction, while also challenging assumptions about the relationship between social class and intellectual potential. Their own children, 5-year-old Catherine and 3-year-old Edmund, named for family members whose memory deserved honor despite past difficulties, were being raised with appreciation for both their English heritage and American opportunities, learning from their parents' example that love and success could be achieved through partnership that honored individual differences rather than requiring conformity to rigid social expectations. The couple divided their time between elegant homes in Boston and at restored Thornfield Manor, where Cordelia had reclaimed her family's legacy while also creating something entirely new in her marriage to a man who had learned to value her independence as much as her affection. As she watched new immigrants disembark from the latest Blackstone vessel, carrying their own hopes and fears toward uncertain futures in America, Cordelia reflected upon the journey that had brought her from desperation to fulfillment, while teaching her that the greatest adventures were not geographic but emotional, requiring courage to abandon familiar patterns in favor of relationships that honored both tradition and progress. Her marriage had proved that love need not require possession or rescue, but could flourish through daily choices to build something beautiful together, whether an empire of ships connecting distant shores or simply a life of meaning that created opportunities for others to find their own paths toward happiness and fulfillment. The young woman who had once believed herself ruined by scandal had discovered that apparent endings could become new beginnings when faced with courage and supported by love that recognized no boundaries between personal and professional success, creating possibilities that neither partner could have achieved alone, but which their union had made not only possible but inevitable through their shared commitment to values that transcended conventional expectations about marriage and business partnerships.